just as kind of like an icebreaker, Brian, how did you get into sales? What was your first sales job?
Yeah, my first sales job was an internship actually after junior year of college. I interned at Anheuser-Busch, which is a beer company. Most people are familiar with
Yeah.
Bud Light or some of the different 200 some brands they had, but not to diss Anheuser-Busch in front of 100 plus people. But I think I learned pretty quickly like what I didn't like about sales. It was very outside sales, no commission, a
Yeah.
lot of travel, Excel spreadsheets, things like that versus inside sales more or less in software.
And you get to work from home too, which is pretty cool.
That is pretty nice. It's pretty warm in
Yeah.
here.
Um, let's get started, everyone. Say hi in the chat if you haven't yet. I'm going to share my screen real quick, and then we're going to get to, we got some really good content planned for you guys today. So we're going to talk about negotiating. So the reason why I wanted to have our guest on today is Brian, President's Club 4 times now, and you're working on your 5th this year. So one of the things that I really like to do is get people that are actually selling in the field using some of these frameworks, and just to unpack how our guest today, Brian, has been able to do that in a couple different positions, and especially at Gong. And I think the goal that we have with negotiating is, how do we approach some of these Q4 negotiations without having to give like massive discounts and negotiate away all of our commission. So Brian's our guest today. He is a senior mid-market AE at Gong. My name's Jason Bay. I run a company called Outbound Squad. So I do sales coaching, training for SDRs, account executives, that sort of stuff. So we're going to dig in. A couple things. We would love to answer as many questions as we can. So if you have questions that pop up, feel free to drop it into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to it. So Brian, what I figured that we could start with here, and for everyone else, we're going to talk about why it's important to be good at negotiating and what our objective is. And then we're going to get really tactical about how Brian negotiates deals at Gong. So let's start first with like our objective. How do you think about negotiating, Brian? And why do you feel like it's a skill that you need to be really good at?
Yeah, I think the mindset I try to take first and foremost is that it's not like a me against Jason situation, but like I'm almost an advocate and like working on behalf of Jason to get the customer or prospect what they would need to feel super, super excited about the partnership. So given that framing and given that context, I think the language you use with customers and prospect matters, saying things like partnership versus contract, and learning what's most important to you to get the team really excited versus what's going to get the deal done. Little differences in language, I think, make a really big difference. And just the overall importance of negotiating in general, like, think if you have $1 million quota, if you're discounting on average 20% across your deals, you need to close 20% more than in total deals to hit the same target and hit the same number. There's definitely an aspect of discounting that's always going to help get deals across the finish line. But I just think it's really important to try to put ourselves in the customer or prospect shoes as much as possible. And oftentimes price is not the number one thing they individually care about in their role. So it's just really important to run discovery at every point throughout the cycle.
Let's throw a question out to everyone. On average, what percentage do you discount your deals? Let us know in the chat. On average, what percentage do you discount your deals? Yeah,
hopefully people's buyers aren't also on this webinar, Jason.
Yeah.
They're going to hold everyone accountable here. What do you mean? You only gave me 5%.
We got 10%, 10 to 15, 3, 10 to 15. Let us know in the chat. We'll give you a couple more seconds. On average, how much do you tend to discount? Yeah, Lori says we can't discount at all. Danae says 20%. Yeah, 10%. So yeah, 10 to 20%. And I think the goal here is if we can, whatever that percentage is, if it's 20%, if we could cut that down by 25 or 50% and get it around 15 or 10%, it's the same amount of work. You're just saving yourself, one, it's commissions, like you said, back in your pocket, but it's just less that you have to do to hit target and hit your accelerators and all that other kind of stuff. So let's talk before we get into sort of the tactics and all that stuff, like let's start really high level with, I love what you said around being on the same side as the buyer and having a common goal. In your experience, what are buyers trying to accomplish through a negotiation? Like, why do they negotiate?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on like who you sell to. So in my role at Gong, we're selling to chief revenue officers or VPs of sales that I think just have it a little bit innately in them that they want to get the best possible deal for maybe
Yeah,
themselves and their own ego, but also for their company and the P&L behind it. I think ultimately why folks negotiate in the first place is kind of to secure the best possible deal and feel like they're doing their own business a positive in terms of, hey, we already want to move forward with you all. It's my goal to make sure I'm representing our business in a positive way. And two, making sure that the partnership is just makes sense in the first place. Maybe they have a really defined price point where if it's, X amount, they would be comfortable moving forward. But at the
yeah.
current, it doesn't make sense in the first place from whatever ROI that they've already calculated behind the scenes or potentially with you as well.
Yeah. So when you say represent their business in the best way possible, is that I need to, as a VP of sales, let's say in your case, I need to be able to go to my CRO and my CFO and say, I tried. Like
Yes.
I did my very best to not take this at list price.
I think that's the main driver. It'd
Mhm.
be great to get a VP of sales perspective as well on this, but from what I've heard in conversations with those folks, that is the main driver. And I think it's important to kind of frame it at the end of the day. Say I'm selling to Jason, and Jason, you're that VP of sales. If the contract's for 100K, it doesn't actually cost you a cent, right? It costs your company money. So it's not
Yeah.
like you're incurring and feeling that pain. You just need to represent the business in a positive way if you already decided that
Yeah.
we're the best possible vendor and partner for you all. So a lot of it's more psychological driven. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's 95 or 100. It more matters that you feel like you got the best absolute deal and that you're able to justify that to whoever you need to speak to internally, CFO, CEO, et cetera, that here's what you were able to, bring them down on, and here's why that's such a great move.
Yeah. You know what's interesting too is I'll ask that sometimes too when someone's like gotten to the point where like we're vendor of choice, they want to move forward. I say, hey, Brian, usually, people are asking for a discount, at this point because we just need to go back to your CRO and your CFO and show them that you did your due diligence and bring a win back to them. Is that what we're trying to accomplish here? And a lot of people are pretty candid about it. Sharpen the pencil. I hear a lot, I'm just like, okay, dude. Um, so I'll drop this into the chat. So I think representing their business in the best way possible, there could be a legitimate number two, their budget threshold. So there could be some sort of budget threshold that if they exceed that amount, which I don't know what it is for you, but prior to 2023, for sales training at a company like the size of Gong, around 30 to 40K, there's typically a budget threshold that kicks in that needs like extra approval. So the VP of sales was not allowed to greenlight that. It had to be approved by the CRO, who would then work with the CEO oftentimes or the CFO. So there could be budget thresholds. And I added a third one there for sport. How often do you find that, Brian? It's like, especially with Gong, I imagine the types of accounts that you're working where this is a really great logo and they're doing this because they just know that they can because you guys really want to work with them. How often do you find that that's the case?
But to put a number on it, maybe 20-30% of the time.
Yeah.
It's hard to delineate. Sometimes I think the most accurate representation is it's usually all three to a certain degree. There just might be one that's most prevalent that you're able to kind of spot.
Got it. Okay, let's keep moving. So, and again, let us know as we're kind of going through this. Let us know if you guys have any questions. Drop it into the Q&A. We want to try to customize the content as much as possible. So if you have specific situations that you run into, or you feel pressure to discount and that sort of thing, let us know in the chat. We can help you out. Okay. Yeah, so Steve asks, if you're getting to the CFO or budget approver early on, I feel like I get a better idea if they're asking for a discount just because versus actually understanding the real issue. What are your thoughts on this? So I think his question is the timing in which you get the question. Is it something that's really early on before you've really done great discovery versus we're at the finish line and we just got to get this over the hump? What are your thoughts on Steve's question?
Yeah, immediate thoughts is definitely means more if it's coming from the CFO or budget holder that
Yeah.
uh it's a bit more of a serious conversation versus if it's early on with a manager, director level, it's like they might not even be aware of the certain budget. So I'm going to kind of deflect a little bit. I think to your point, Jason, I think number one, taking a step back, like confirming that if we are going to negotiate around numbers, like, hey, outside of commercials, are we vendor of choice? Is there anything
Yeah.
else that has to take place? Or would we be able to sign today if we're able to come to a mutually, agreed upon terms? So just getting a really strong pulse that, hey, we are truly at the 1 yard line. Hey, you are truly the signer, with asking them, hey, if we do come to agreed upon terms, are you the one that would execute this? Would it have to go to anyone else? And
Yeah.
then once you're at that point, just running discovery with the CFO or budget holder. Like if the price is 50K and they ask for 40K, it's how'd you come up with that? Is there a certain number you're trying to back into? Do you
Yeah.
have any flexibility to come off that? Just continuing to prod a little bit deeper before you can kind of position where you might be able to help.
Yeah. Love it. Keep the questions coming, you guys. Um, let's move before we get into the actual mechanics of the negotiation itself. I want to talk prep. So one of the things that we talked about in our prep call um, was this concept of, the best preparation for a great negotiation is doing great discovery. And the discovery is really what you anchor the entire negotiation around. Do you want to talk about like the prep work prior to a negotiation call through that discovery lens? Like, what do you want to make sure that you know of and have really good alignment around before you start talking commercials?
Yeah, I want to make sure that we have a mutually agreed upon like ROI or what the value of the solution could bring to the table. So in a way, the negotiation does start from the very first call because you need to get a really concrete understanding of the business case. Else you're going to get eaten alive later when you're not able to push back on things like value. So for us, what that sounds like is understanding their top priority, understanding a metric that's being impacted by that, understanding where that metric's at today in terms of current state, an ideal state of where they're trying to get that to, and then what the delta of that's ultimately worth. So just as an example, their conversion rates are struggling, their win rates in sales, they're at 20% today. They're trying to get them to 30%. That's worth $2 million if they were able to accomplish that. And it's not just me coming up with those figures, but it's getting someone like Jason or whoever we're speaking to, their buy-in around the about ballpark figures. So I want to make sure I have that piece early on. Don't always uncover that in the very first call, and that's totally okay. Maybe you build on that in call 2 or call 3, but that's a great anchor point later come the negotiation that I'm going to write down when I prep. So I'm able to say, hey, it sounds like we're arguing over $5,000 here. Just to zoom out, like, want to make sure, like, the reason why we're looking at us in the first place is we identified here's the gap and it's worth in excess of $2 million. Has that changed?
Yeah. So what's interesting is I think of as a buyer, I want to de-risk a purchase as much as possible and remove uncertainty around it working or not. Gartner's got an interesting stat: 53% of buyers regret software purchases. It's kind of crazy. I mean, it's over half the people regret buying stuff. So you think about like de-risking the project for the buyer, like just reducing price, that doesn't really de-risk it that much for them versus going back to your discovery. And if they're not bought into what the ROI that your solution can provide, there's probably something there. There's some skepticism around whether or not they believe that your solution can actually deliver. Is that oftentimes what happens when you get into these conversations, is that you figure out there's a box that probably isn't being checked with Gong in this case that like we need to revisit?
if there's too big of a gap between like our proposed pricing and what they're asking for, there probably is a gap, or
Yeah.
maybe we missed the mark at some point leading up to that, and like showing
Mhm.
them how that's possible and getting their buy-in there. But Daniel, you put a question in the chat, like how do you calculate ROI? For us, we're not saying like, hey, our company is going to deliver you exactly 1.45 million because of these crazy calculations. We
Yeah.
keep it a little bit more broad of like, where are you at today in terms of your biggest priority? Where are you trying to get to? And what would that be worth? So to use that example again, with us, it might be win rates or retention. It's at 20%, trying to get it to 30%, and that's worth 2 million. So we're not saying, hey, we're going to bring you exactly 2 million in revenue, but that's the greater target that we've identified as our number one priority. And we're going to be a driving factor in helping you achieve that. So
Yep.
just continuing to go back to that.
And you're weighting, just to throw out a number, let's say your solution, it's 200K, you're weighting that against a $2 million problem, essentially.
Exactly. And hopefully then
Yeah.
throughout the demo, throughout every conversation, you're able to showcase how your solution is going to help you bridge that gap from current state to ideal state.
Okay. Let's talk second about the gives and gets, the negotiation levers, etc. One of the things I find in working with reps and doing a lot of negotiations myself, which is, I don't know, it's interesting. We negotiate with the same types of people. So it's interesting because sales executives sort of understand the game of what's going on, and it actually makes it harder in many cases, in my experience, to negotiate with them. Let's talk about the levers and knowing and predetermining what your gives and gets are so that you kind of know what to do. How do you think about, and it may be set by Gong in terms of like your limitations on what you can do, but I think what people are really quick to do is just to give a discount. Like, how do you think about levers outside of just reducing total contract price, which is something that you can do, obviously. But outside of that, how do you think about the areas where you're willing to sort of give and get?
Yeah, I think the first step is, it's a good exercise for everyone to do, is like build out a list of those gives and gets that are specific to your organization. For us, outside of just like pricing gives, there's likely other things we can do to help, in essence, de-risk the investment or de-risk the partnership for them. That could include a greater level of implementation or services. It could include maybe including another user that could get value from the solution. So without reducing the total amount they would spend, maybe we can provide an extra user or two that they
Yeah,
weren't thinking about beforehand. Maybe we could change up the start dates or get a little bit creative with like how we're structuring it. And then from our end, I'm trying to think of the other pieces where I can go to bat for them, for Jason, to get, you the best possible deal. Things like
yeah,
multi-year, it's things like adding in additional products, committing to additional users. So I'm gonna be very transparent with like what those levers look like. And I think it's important for those reasons to do that in terms of an exercise, in terms of gives and gets. So kind of like your menu going into that call, like what is the art of the possible in the first place.
yeah. Let me share my screen, and I'll share this post with you guys too. That I just put this up on LinkedIn a couple days ago. Here's a list of things that you can do besides lowering the contract price. Um, so you mentioned a couple of these. Does anything else stick out to you, Brian, here that you would normally look at? Because I feel like those bonuses, like offering premium support or a specific implementation team, or hey, I know we're signing up your AEs, but how about we throw in some of your CS team for free, kind of thing. Like, does anything else on here stick out to you that people should be thinking about? And then we'll kind of ask the audience if there's stuff here that sticks out to them too.
I mean, all of them. I just took a screenshot of this, so hope everyone else is as well. It's got my mind thinking. I think the case study one can be big, especially for like early stage companies, if that's important to your business. Uh, I've also offered in the past. A lot of organizations are doing sales trainings or sales kickoffs in January, February. I've mentioned, hey, when is that date? assuming we get the partnership in place, that'd be a great time to do like a second training. Once the team's already been live, I'd be more than happy to come out there and, make the ask for my company. So I think things like that can kind of help as
Yeah.
well. And I love the payment one. So I wasn't thinking of those top of mind, but do that all the time of like, hey, is this more about total cost for you, Jason? Or are you thinking about cash flow being most important? And maybe it's more cash flow to them, and there's a way you can do semi-annual payments or push it out 30, 60 days without having to impact the price.
Yeah. One of the things that I like to ask for a lot too is if I'm working with one particular business unit is, hey, one thing that's really important for me is that when we start working together, can I get an introduction to the VP of so and so in this other business unit? Or can we get a case study or a testimonial from so and so or get introduced to those types of folks? There's all kinds of stuff that's like that's pretty easy for the customer to do that will mean a lot for you and help you get a second or third deal. But let us know in the chat. The list you see on the screen here, what ideas do you have from this? Is there one or two of these? Let me know in the chat. From what you see on the screen, is there anything here that sticks out to you? Write it into the chat. Let us know. What could you start bringing up or game planning with your manager or your sales leadership besides just going in and saying, I can reduce the total contract value? Is there anything from what you see on the screen here or what Brian shared that you could maybe use? Let us know in the chat.
How did this post only get 51 likes, Jason? This is
You got to give me some of that juice you get on your post, dude.
gold. It's a pretty extensive list.
Yeah, the pro services one Brandon dropped in is like those are really easy things, to add. Super easy, and it means so much to the customer to feel like I'm getting extra support.
Yeah.
Or I'm getting the best implementation team. I'm going to get the implementation team that helped XYZ, company do it. Yeah, the multi-year is big.
Yeah, I had
Thank you, Brandon. Brandon's like, just boosted your likes by one.
I had a champion I spoke to 2 days ago. I'm running this larger pilot in early December. It's a 100K plus deal. And he was super forward with me. They haven't brought up price once. It's not that important to them. They do lots in
Yeah.
terms of revenue. But he shared with me, he's like, the biggest thing that I need is for this to just be super, super successful. We actually rolled out a different software product about a year ago that's been a pretty big flop. And I've
Yeah.
taken a little bit of heat with my CEO and with other executives because we're going to have to attrit them and leave them. So I need to make sure that this is super, super successful. And the way I was able to get that answer is just asking like, hey, make up the name. Hey, Steve, I know we've been speaking for a couple months now. Like, mind if I ask like kind of a weird question? Why is this so important to you? Like, why have you invested so much time in this personally? Just to kind of understand their personal motivation in terms of like what they're driving towards and what they care about most. Because now that I know that, we can position more things around like implementation services. I might even bring like a customer success manager to a call coming up soon to be like, hey, this is who you'd be working with to get them
Yeah.
super comfortable. Because the number one thing he cares about is he doesn't want to fall flat again because he's going to have to advocate for this and put his neck on the line. It's going to impact his career mobility and status and
Yeah.
things.
Just really understanding and taking the time to understand what's important to the buyer, you know? So let's transition into the actual negotiation here. How do you know when you've started the negotiation? Because I think it's really, we should talk about when the negotiation actually starts. Because oftentimes it depends on what you're selling, but oftentimes there's not a call that's dedicated to that necessarily. You have like a really good third call where you've kind of demoed, or maybe you've done like an executive alignment call, and then it just starts happening. Number talk starts happening. So how do you know when you've started a negotiation? Let's start with that first, and we'll talk about, kind of the do's and don'ts and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'll say I know when they're trying to start it, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to participate and play the game with them. As you shared, if
I love
it's
that.
on the VP of sales or CRO, it might be a discovery call. They haven't even seen the product and they're asking about net 60 payments or quarterly what you
Yeah.
can do. So I think
Yeah.
the biggest piece first is like to what I shared earlier, like making sure you are truly at that 1 yard line. And if you're not, and they're asking for certain, in essence, gives, you need to reverse them. Don't go on defense and start talking about what's possible, what's not. I'll just ask a question like, hey, Jason, like I'm really glad you brought that up. That's a great question. Curious, typically when folks ask about payment terms, like they're ready to sign and move forward. Like, do you feel like you're at that place?
And then what if they say no? Because it's the first or second call and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'd say totally understand. If it's cool with you, I'm happy to have that conversation. What I want to make sure of before we start talking commercials and nitty gritty is that you are fully bought into the value we can provide and feel like this would be a great investment to make at XYZ company. So you have my commitment that we'll speak about that at the end. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, got it. And Jim asked the question in there, how open and transparent are you if someone in that first call says, how much does Gong cost?
Very open, very
Yeah.
transparent. I try to showcase pricing on the first call, if not by the end of the second call. Can kind of
Mhm.
depend how your organization likes to play things. I think at the very least, Jim, even if your org says save it for call 2 or save it for call 3, I think provide them at least with a range. Say, hey, Jason, how many users would you be looking at? Awesome. Depending on a couple different factors like the number of products, number of users, how long the term, it'll probably look like somewhere between 15 and 25,000, but I'd need to learn a little bit more first.
Yeah.
Just to
So
just
you're,
kind of give them the sense in case that's completely out of the ballpark of some like predefined budget. If they came in with $1,000 to spend, you'd rather disqualify them early than invest a ton of time for something that was never going to close.
yeah. So that's a good way to disqualify something early so that you don't waste a ton of time on it. Um, so if they say, let's talk about the audience that's in that call. So let's say it's a little bit later stage and you've done some discovery and that sort of stuff. Who do you negotiate with? How do you think about that part? So, like, what's really typical, I'm sure, for someone in your situation, which is very typical for me, is I have maybe a sales manager or an enablement manager and like a head of sales, maybe a director of sales that comes in and I
Mhm.
start the conversation there. And then we're getting the VP of sales and CRO involved much later. So, do you negotiate with those other folks, those managers, those directors on the call, or are you saying, yeah, and you're smiling. So it sounds like you have a
Yeah. No, I'm not. And the reason for that is say it's $50,000 and you negotiate with the enablement manager and it's $40,000. And after that negotiation, you go back and forth on what's possible. That's the new approved pricing. When they bring that to the CRO or VP of sales, they're going to want to take
yeah,
another bite out of the apple per se. Really, really critical to keep that pricing integrity. And again, probably broken record. If you looked at my transcription, I probably said discovery 100 times, but you need to run discovery with that enablement manager and say, hey, happy to have that conversation. Help me understand, like if we came to agreement today on what it would take to move forward, like would you be able to execute? They say no, they'd have to run this by XYZ person. And then you can come in and make a really strong recommendation and say, hey, would love to save both of us time. I know you've put a lot of investment. You've been a really strong champion of Gong. I'd be happy to loop in my senior leader as well. Would we be able to get XYZ CFO to a call and maybe we can all put our heads together and make sure you all feel like you're walking away with something that gets the team super excited about the partnership.
yeah. So I think that's another really key part too, because this happens a lot where you have people that below the line come in and they want to get a price to like run up the flagpole to a leader to see if the conversation makes sense. I get that a lot. And that's a really good indicator that, from a multi-threading standpoint, that like, hey, the senior people that are going to actually be able to approve something like this are maybe unaware of the conversation. Do you ever have that happen to you just with Gong being so popular where you have people that come in are really excited about it and there isn't really like an open project or anything like that where they're actually looking for a revenue intelligence solution?
All the time. And I think a
No.
lot of folks think probably not because they're so familiar with Gong, but I sell net new logos. So it's all to organizations. They don't have Gong yet. They either have nothing and just do manual Zoom recordings, they don't record calls, or they use a cheaper alternative. So typically there's either zero line item for something like revenue or conversation intelligence, or if there is a line item, it's very, very small. So yes, we'll have a lot of folks come inbound or we self-source someone outbound, and there's no active project, 95% of the time.
So you're very firm, just for everyone watching, you're very firm that if I don't have people that can approve this deal and move it forward, I don't negotiate with people that are not the CFO or like the CRO, someone senior that can actually approve and move the deal forward.
Yeah, there's no point. I think you're wasting time
Love it.
and money.
Okay. Yeah. So let's dig into sort of the framework around how you would approach that conversation.
Okay.
So, and by the way, for those of you watching, I would speculate that just based on my experience and observation, that probably 3/4 of the time people are not doing that. And that means 3/4 of the time they're giving a number to someone who has to give that number to someone else, who then has to talk to someone else usually. They're not usually negotiating with the people that can move the deal forward. So I think that's just like such an important thing to highlight. So let's say you do get people on that call, your champion brings in the CFO or whoever it is that you're going to be negotiating with. How do you tend to structure a call like that? And let me know if there's anything that you tend to do maybe prior to that call to prep for it.
Yeah, great question. So the first piece, and I think like part of the key to me getting that CFO or getting the ultimate signer decision maker on is I'll do the concept of what I'd refer to as like jersey matching. So I'm gonna make the ask of saying, hey, Jason, let's eliminate a step here and make this easiest for you. Would you be able to get your CFO to join a short call? I'd be happy to bring one of my revenue leaders who has more potential than me to influence things like commercials or what the agreement looks like. And we can put us all in a room together. So I think that jersey matching piece is pretty key. I make sure to not bring in power on my end in terms of like my sales leaders before it's needed for that reason, to make sure it's a give almost from our end. In
What is
terms of,
that? What level of seniority, just for other people that are thinking about running that play, is this your sales manager? Is it your VP? Like, who is it typically that you invite on?
I'd say it depends. It's going to be a form of level up. So like I know my sales manager or my direct report can have that conversation, but if I had to use her earlier for an important demo, an important call, then I'm
Yeah.
probably gonna go one level up. So I just always make it, I always go one level higher to make it sound like it's a give and it's somebody new. So director or VP. And if I had to use that director before, I'll probably go one level above that.
Yeah. Love that. I mean, that's a really simple thing that anyone watching this can start doing. If you're not, that's a gift for sure.
And then
Cool. Cool.
yeah.
All right.
And then when it comes to preparation, one, if you're going to have someone new on the line on your end, making sure that they are fully prepped. I'll always put together like a Google Doc or internal calendar invite with like all the info in it at the same time. That's going to line item like, hey, who are we speaking to? What was the business case identified? What was the ROI? And one of the most important things I do as well is I list out all of the other concessions we've already provided. So if you have negotiated for any reason up until that point, make sure to list those out as concessions. And then I'm also going to think outside the box of that. So ran a 3-month evaluation. Maybe we did a 2-week pilot. Those are gives. Those are concessions on our end. That's a lot of time invested. So I make sure to line that out because when I start that conversation, I like to provide a little bit of context for who's on the phone on their end, if it's their CFO, their VP, whoever that might be, and say, hey, just to take a quick step back, would love to share kind of what led us to this point. This is the opportunity we identified. So far, we've done this 4-month evaluation. Our team has also provided 2 weeks of free access to the technology. We ran 3 different trainings during the course of it. And we've already moved from a 3-year agreement, which is our standard term, down to 2 years.
Yeah.
So you kind of make that list of gives at the beginning, and it sets an anchor that you've already invested a ton into that partnership, and hopefully prevents a laundry list from their end of additional asks. So that's a really big piece to it.
Got it. So you're spending the first, I'm guessing, 5-10 minutes going through the opportunity. So you're presenting the discovery. Like, why are we talking? What priority is this aligned to? What metrics are we driving? What's the problem we're solving? What's that worth to you? Oh, and here's what we've already done for you. You're outlining all of those things. And then at that point, it as a buyer, when I'm on that side, I feel like you said, use the word investment. I mean, I feel like they're really invested in getting our business at that point. So what happens next after that?
Yeah, I'd be pretty direct. Like if there's no ask coming into it, I'd say like we're super excited about the partnership. Like we can get the team going as soon as tomorrow, November 30th. Is there anything preventing us from wanting to sign and move forward at this point? And you put the ball like in their camp versus being like, what else do we need to do? What number do we need to arrive on? Just be assumptive. Like that's everything we provide up until that point. You can even prompt your champion and say, hey, Jason, anything you'd add from like the value you've seen over the past 4 months in the evaluation of Gong? Try to use their champion to kind of layer in as well. But just be assumptive. Be like, hey, like, we're ready to rock on our end. We're super excited about the partnership. Is there anything preventing us from moving forward? Happy to share the agreement with you.
Yeah. And I imagine your heart races a little bit when you put that question out there, right? It's like a new executive that you haven't met yet. What percentage of the time, kind of roughly, do people not give any sort of resistance? And you're like, okay,
Pretty infrequently, but it still
yeah,
sets the anchor of like kind of where it's at. Definitely have had it happen where they're saying, hey, we're super excited about it as well. Maybe they
yeah,
have a couple of questions around like start date or implementation or what customer success looks like. Um, but yeah, it happens. So I mean, don't assume, don't come in assuming that they need something.
So at this point, do you confirm again in this call that you're vendor of choice? Do you confirm that again with the executive?
Typically not. I think if I've gotten that confirmation from champion or champions already, I kind of take that and work it into the call of like, hey, here's all the value the team recommended we move forward with us.
Yeah,
But I think if you're hitting a snag during the negotiation, like don't be afraid to like take a step back and be like, hey, it seems like we're pretty far apart here. Like just to confirm, like, want to double check, like we are vendor of choice. Is that correct? Would the team want to see any other evaluation or any further demonstrations to know that we're the right solution for them to kind of see if they pull the conversation forward and they're like, no, we just want to talk numbers, or if it actually is like a greater value problem as well.
got it. So let's say that at this point, the situation is, the executive, like the CFO needs, like they want to do more negotiation around the price. How will you approach it at this point?
Yeah, I'd say I'd probably ask them a question. I'd go back to discovery at the end of the day. So I'd say, hey, I know what we put forward was 50,000 in terms of annual spend. Like, would love to hear from you, Jason. Like, is there how are you thinking about what you can invest in a solution like this? Is there a number you're trying to back into?
Yeah. And if they say, well, we had 35K budgeted and it's a 50K deal.
No. I would ask, how did you come up with the 35,000?
Yeah. It's a very similar approach to what you outlined before. It's not going to
Yep.
be any kind of, and I think that's an important thing to note too, that, just because you're getting exposed to an executive and someone that you maybe haven't had interactions with up to this point, that you
Yep.
can still hold strong. Like you don't have to cave in.
Totally. And you just keep running with it saying, hey, understanding that we are 50,000, like that's the investment required in our solution. And the team only had 35,000. Like, how are you thinking about getting the additional 15?
Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of the keys to like holding firm and like driving this sort of like
Yeah.
language and partnery approach is like all the value that you built up until that point, having the champion and, hopefully an army of champions that are so excited, and that CFO or decision maker is feeling the heat as well, that like they need to move forward with you because there's so many people at the org that are excited and they would be let down if you didn't move
Yeah.
forward. That's a huge, huge piece to it.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple situations just based on what people asked, a couple pricing things. So Florin, what's up, Florin? Um, he asked, how do you deal with companies like Vendor or Tropic that come into a deal and have data that your org in general is willing to provide X discount, even if you as an AE don't generally provide those discounts? Has that ever happened to you before, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah, how do you handle situations like that? I hate that, by the
I
way. Yeah.
the great news is, just to take a step back, if they're using Vendor or Tropic, the deal is likely going to close. So just take a second to acknowledge that they're enlisting another service to negotiate the deal. I've had to use them, 10 times. I've closed all 10 deals. So that's the great news. The bad news is they're going to try to beat you up on price or make it a little bit more challenging. So you want to approach it like anything else in terms of like, I want to keep my champion really close. So I do have to engage that person that, they've enlisted me to with Vendor or Tropic, but I want to tell my champion at the beginning, like, hey, we're happy to work with them and engage with them. But like my ask from you is to continue to stay involved because, we've done X, Y, and Z over the last 2 months, 3 months in terms of the evaluation. Would love to continue to get your perspective and coaching on how to drive this forward. So making sure you don't get siloed to Vendor and Tropic and get put on like an island per se.
Yeah.
But outside of that, you just kind of have similar conversations with them, except you're framing it for the company and all the concessions you've given them up until that point, the value they've seen, how many people are excited about it, and how you want to work with them to, make this as easy as possible.
And if you hit a snag with them, is it, hey, let's pause the conversation. Let me go back to Mr. or Mrs. CRO and reevaluate this? And like, is that generally what happens if you're not able to come to an agreement?
Yeah, and I hopefully don't have too many Vendor Tropic people. I usually run this play on every Vendor Tropic deal at some point, but you do hit a snag with them, and I just kind of say, hey, I'm not sure where to go from here. Like we're unable to meet you at X price point. You may have data around that, but that was likely from a year or 2 years ago. We've done different price increases. We've had different tech advancements and new features and et cetera rolled out since. So it's just different. You're comparing apples to oranges. And then you have to go back to your champion and basically sound the alarm bell of like, hey, I think we're way too far off. Like from my understanding, they're using, data from deals a year or 2 years ago. And, we're unable to get to that commercial point. Like how would you coach me in this situation? Like I'm at a loss in terms of what I can be doing to best support you all.
Yeah. Dude, I think that everything that you've anchored the negotiation around is just, we have to double click on that. Like these people really want Gong by this point. They really want Gong. They know it will solve the business problem. You're the vendor of choice. Like they really want it. I think a lot of people get into negotiating type conversations where people are talking about price and they're not even sure yet, the buyer, on who they really want to go forward with. You know what I mean? Is it generally the same process if the company you're selling to has a procurement team where it's like the CRO is like, all right, now let me set you up with our procurement so-and-so, which is always annoying because it's like a manager or something usually, and someone's just like, I've had people email me in the email introduction that I get to them, it's a procurement manager, and they just ask for 33% off, like through an email, you know? But is it generally the same process for handling a situation where you need to work through procurement as well?
Same exact piece. And I'm gonna double down on my own point of like, hopefully when you start that conversation with procurement, you haven't given an inch up until that point. Because think of it from that procurement person's perspective, they get comped on how much they're able to shave off the price
Yeah.
and how much they're able to save their org. So if you've already negotiated this 50K deal down to 40K and that 40K gets brought to procurement, guess what? They're going to want to take 33% off the 40K. To them, that 40K is the approved your pricing. They're not thinking back
Yeah.
to that the real pricing of it all. So it's so critical just to be able to get the deal across the line in the first place, that you're holding that integrity until you're at that 1 yard line with procurement. There's nothing else that has to happen. Legal's done, security's done. They're so bought into the value. And the very last thing is just making sure this fits budgetarily.
Yeah. Let's talk about Thomas asked this question, and there was another person that asked a similar type of question. I think it was Brandon. What if at this point they're like, well, hey, Brian, XYZ competitor, we're getting Chorus or we're getting Clarity for, 80 cents on the dollar compared to your price. What can you do for us? How do you approach those types of conversations when they're comparing you to a less expensive competitor?
Yeah, discovery. And it happens in every deal. Thomas, it's a really great question, like for us in our world, and probably for most of the 125 people in the chat. We have us, and then there's 20, 25 cheaper alternatives. So I think the first key is like, don't badmouth them, don't trash talk them in any way. I say, hey, XYZ they're a really great solution. There's a lot of cheaper alternatives to what we do. And I'm going to turn it back on them, like curious, knowing that we're 50 and they're 25. Like, how are you thinking about justifying the investment in us given that gap in price? And I just kind of want to hear where their head's at in terms of like their mindset of things. If it's late stage and they're asking, hey, we have this quote for 25 and you're 50, what can you do? I would turn back to them and say like, hey, it sounds like we're a vendor of choice, correct? Like putting price aside, you would choose us. Great. Knowing that they're 25 and we're 50, what does the team feel comfortable in investing in us, given you've seen, all this value difference up until this point? Maybe they say 35, maybe they say 40. And then you kind of play hardball from there and say, hey, like, as I hope you can appreciate, like that's, not something we'd be able to get to. Like, how did you all come up with that? Like, how's the team thinking about it in terms of ROI versus the $2 million priority you shared with me, last call?
Yeah, I love that. And I think the important thing to know too, to bring the conversation full circle, is like the buyer's just doing their due diligence. That's a question they should ask. Like they're going to get hammered by their CFO if they didn't ask, hey, your competitor that we looked into has a cheaper price. What can you guys do? They're going to get hammered if they don't ask that question. Another thing that I've seen to work very successfully with reps, and I do this myself too, is to talk about why you're the least risky solution. And you can just ask them, let's just look at your different options. You're considering, doing nothing. You're considering using competitor A, or you're considering using us. What in your eyes makes us the least risky option between the three? And just letting them sell you on why you're the best solution. And if there's a particular way that you differentiate from your competitors too, like how do you assign like a value to that? So in your case, we're trying to make up 5 or 10K. I'm sure there's lots of things that Gong do that the competing solution doesn't. It's like, let's talk about the value of that. And let's talk about how implementation and the stickiness of the product and the adoption, how that could be affected if you don't have this thing that we have, So I think like the least risky option is another kind of interesting way to think about it too.
Yeah, that's a great approach. And I try to keep it away from, I try to get them to reframe as well. Oftentimes the way they'll think about it is like, hey, competitor A is 25K, you're 50K, are the additional features worth 25K more with your solution? So I try to offer like a light suggestion, say like, hey, Jason, like I appreciate the way you're thinking about it. Like first and foremost, like everyone that looks at us will always look at 2 or 3 cheaper alternatives. And we appreciate that and appreciate your forwardness so far. What I would encourage you to do though, is not just think about like, hey, are our features worth the additional 10, 20 incremental spend? Because you're not buying features, right? You're buying, zooming out, right? The reason you're evaluating in the first place is we have this win rate issue. It's at this percent. We're trying to get it to this. That's worth $2 million. And you've already shared with us that you feel like we are the best solution to make sure you're able to capitalize on this $2 million potential payoff. So while I can appreciate that there is a 10, 20K difference, I just want to make sure we're not losing sight of that in the process.
Love that. Always bringing it back, like anchoring it back to the big picture. Love
Yeah,
that.
have to.
Okay. Vinay asks, what are the, and we're kind of at that Q&A portion of the session, you guys. We have about 8 minutes left. So if you got questions, either drop them into the Q&A or the chat. Vinay asks, what are the main reasons deals slip during negotiations? So maybe think about recent deals, Brian, or when you were first getting started too. What would happen during some of these negotiations where deals would tend to slip?
I'd say the major one is that you think you're negotiating with the decision maker or the signer, but they're not. And
Yeah.
sometimes you might not know and you ask, and that they say something incorrect, or they thought they had power and they truly don't. So I'd say that's one of the main ones, where you run this negotiation and then they're not signing for it right away, and they share, hey, I've actually got to talk to my CEO really quickly, even though they told you a couple of conversations ago that they were able to sign for this and had authority and things like that.
Yeah.
I think just trying to double down and confirm again that like decision process of what else needs to happen for us to move forward. Is there anything preventing us from moving forward today if we, came to the right commercial agreement? Those are the main pieces. Sometimes just like trying to coordinate calendars candidly. If you have today's the 29th and you are fighting to get to power still, and might be really hard to get that CEO or CFO to a call the next day, and that's okay. And sometimes you need to just de-risk your own deal and say, hey, it might not come in this month. That's fine, but I don't want to lose it in general. That's always most important to me.
This is so important. I make this mistake sometimes too, where I'm speaking to a VP of sales who is not the signer, who I thought was, or I didn't ask, or they said they were, or whatever it might be, Blake asks a really good question. What happens when you're negotiating with the non-decision maker, but they've already told you that they're not going to put you in front of the decision maker? How do you deal with getting resistance to your suggestion of, let's save an extra step here, let's get so-and-so on the phone together and we can, iron out the details? What do you do when you get resistance to that?
Yeah, I'd probably ask, just have a candid conversation first. Be like, hey, is there like mind sharing why that we wouldn't be able to set up a call with them directly, knowing how important this initiative is. Again, going back to what you learned, their priority, learning a little bit more from them first. I think ultimately, if they're like, they refuse to join calls, they're not going to, it's like, okay, that's fine. I think that, puts us in a challenging position, because it's hard for us to go to our team and make some sort of ask, because the first thing my team's going to ask is, hey, does this get the deal signed? Does this get the deal across the line? And I'm going to say, I have no idea. So that just puts us in a bit of a tricky position. Like, Jason, how would you coach us to help you in this situation? Just kind of put it back in their camp of like, what would be helpful. They'll probably recommend something like, hey, let me have that conversation first. And maybe you let that conversation happen, you schedule a follow-up, and you kind of hear through the grapevine, like, hey, if you can get this down to 45 or reduce it down a year, like, we'd be able to move forward. And you kind of play through the middleman there.
How many, again, rough kind of guesstimate, what percentage of your deals do you close where you don't get the economic buyer onto a call?
Maybe like 30%.
Okay. So roughly a third of the time,
Yeah.
you're not able to get the access that you want and you still close the deal for whatever reason.
Yeah. And I think it's an important call. Like, you don't want to blow up the deal trying. Like, I'm gonna frame it for them in terms of why it makes sense to loop them in, but if they're unable to, if they refuse to, I'm not gonna turn this closed lost because we can't get a certain call. So you just kind of put it in their camp and ask them to help you.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, Nina said something in the comments. I think that's super important. It's always important to ask if anything has changed regarding decision process, paper process. You never know, changes in their org or process from day to day. I find that, I don't know, how many executives do you sell to that maybe they're so new they haven't purchased something yet like this, and they actually don't know what the approval processes. Does that ever happen to you?
All the time. I think especially
me
a lot
too.
of a lot of buyers are like newer folks at the org that are trying to launch new
Yep.
initiatives, make changes versus the sales leader that's been there for 10 years. Like they're probably not going to wake up tomorrow and realize they need a new category. They think their way works. So it happens all the time. It's a really great call, Nina. And I'd say just like continue to confirm it throughout. Things can change. They're also just like incorrect a lot of the times. Maybe they did purchase software a year ago, but the process has changed since. That happens all the time as well.
Yeah. One last question and we got to bounce. So Tom asked, what's your opinion on sharing pricing with a non-decision maker? We sort of addressed this at the beginning, but if someone comes inbound and they're a manager of something and they ask you about pricing, are you pretty transparent with them for the most part?
Yes.
With the range and all that stuff? Yeah.
Yep. I'll provide pricing. I'll give a quick walkthrough. I think the keys to that is like, make sure you're being concise, you're being confident in it. I made a post about this the other day, but like if you're not confident delivering price, they're not going to be confident in what the price of it is, in terms of like feeling like the value's there, or even that is the true like approved price. So say it succinctly, say it concisely, and just stay quiet at the end after you present it. Don't ask them, how does that feel? Or any weird questions like that.
Which will take a little bit of practice if you're not used to doing that, to be able to comfortably deliver the price and not hesitate and that sort of thing. Dude, this has been great. Make sure to blow up Brian and myself, our LinkedIn profiles, send us a connect request. And Brian, where can people go to connect with you? What do you want people to go check out?
Yeah, LinkedIn is great. Feel free to add me or give me a follow. And I have a couple of resources linked to my profile too. I have a newsletter, and then I put out some different content around like interview frameworks, cold calling stuff, et cetera, as well through a hosted website. So feel free to check any of that out. I think it's in my 2 like featured categories.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Brian. And thank you everyone else for the participation. And that's all we got for you. Happy negotiating. Let's get a strong Q4 finish. We'll see you everyone later. Have a good one. See ya.